Thanks, Paul. And I'm going to take my cues from the book that Paul held up, Dog Days, Australia After the Boom. The dog days, of course, an expression going back to ancient Egypt, and after that ancient Greece and ancient Rome. In the Mediterraneans were in classical times were very close observers of the firmament, and noticed that on the hottest, sultriest, most difficult days of the year, at the end of July and early August, the dog star Sirius rose above the horizon at the same time as the sun, and they were the dog days, and you knew they were going to be challenging, difficult, bad-tempered days. I'm going to talk mainly about Australia, and the story here is very different from the recent story of growth and inclusion of most other OECD countries, different from New Zealand too. We're still experiencing a long period of economic growth unbroken by recession, by far the longest period in our own history unbroken by recession, 23 years now, and the longest period in any OECD country except for one, the Netherlands, and of course the Netherlands has had a couple of recessions since their 20 plus years ended. So certainly in recent times the Australian experience is unique. And these have been times of rising incomes for almost all Australians, expanding public services for almost all Australians. Australians at all income levels have participated to some extent in the exceptional prosperity of these last 23 years. Employment and labour force participation are much higher now than they were at the beginning of this long period of growth 23 years ago. As I describe at length in the book Dog Days, Australia After the Boom, this sustained prosperity bred a complacency that these good things were a natural part of the Australian condition, and would continue with relatively little effort. Since 2004, I've been describing the Australian condition as the great Australian complacency of the early 21st century. Well, we kept growth going for another decade after the onset of the great Australian complacency, and it's an interesting story of how that happened. And it didn't happen through processes that were sustainable, and things that are not sustainable sooner or later will come to an end. Looking ahead, the next decade will look very different to the past 2 decades in the best of circumstances. The worst of circumstances, it would look more difficult still. Australia in the next decade is likely to face many of the challenges that other OECD countries have been living with over the past couple of decades. And it will face these challenges with the added burden of the political culture that has grown around the great Australian complacency of the early 21st century. The extraordinary period of economic expansion that we've been through has 3 clear phases. For the first roughly a decade, 91 to the end of the century, we had on average the fastest productivity growth of the OECD, and the employment and incomes growth and improvement of services of the 90s up to the turn of the century were based on something that is sustainable, strong growth in multi-factor productivity. This was unusual for Australia. For the first 8 decades of the 20th century, the first 8 decades of our federation, we were one of the worst performers of the OECD. Australia and New Zealand were the worst performers on productivity growth for the first 8 decades of the 21st century. So it was quite a story that Australia, in the last decade, the 10th decade of the century, was at the top of the OECD. And that turnaround was based above all on a remarkable period of productivity-raising reform. I call it the reform era, from 1983 to the end of the century. Productivity-oriented reform and productivity growth both slowed down and then stopped in the early 21st century. From about 2003, from the turn of the century, productivity growth fell sharply. And from the beginning of the new century, there was very little major productivity-raising reform of policy. So it was a natural outcome of policy processes that productivity growth fell. Over the last decade, multi-factor productivity has actually fallen in Australia by an average of 0.3% per annum. This is unusual even in a country that in its first 8 decades as a federation was used to being one of the 2 poorest performers in the OECD. We'd never had a decade of falling productivity before. Well, we've had it now. I refer to multi-factor productivity. Economists talk sometimes about multi-factor productivity, sometimes about labour productivity. Our labour productivity performance has been better. I think you can discount that. You can get better labour productivity simply through the addition of more and more capital to what you're doing, and capital has a cost. It has to be serviced. So it's multi-factor productivity, the productivity of capital and labour and their interaction that really matters. Well, employment and incomes growth and improving government services didn't end with the end of productivity growth. In fact, average incomes grew more rapidly in the next decade than they did in the 90s. And employment continued to grow reasonably strongly. For the early years of this century, we sustained employment and incomes growth through an extraordinary boom in consumption and housing, funded by our banks borrowing abroad in wholesale markets. Our banks became much more indebted to ultimately volatile international wholesale markets than they ever had been before, at least ever since the great crash of 1891. Our banks became the most vulnerable in the OECD on the measure that Martin Wolf of the Financial Times says is the most important measure of vulnerability growing into the global financial crisis. Our banks were more dependent on global wholesale markets even than those of Spain, of Britain, of Ireland. This was unsustainable. What was happening in Australia in the early years of the century has much in common with what was happening at the same time in the other English-speaking countries in Spain, the phenomenon that led to the global financial crisis. From about 2004 or 5, our regulatory authorities started behaving differently from those in other English-speaking countries in Spain, different from the United States, United Kingdom, Ireland and Spain. We didn't have the excess of financial deregulation that those other economies did, and our authorities started to be more assertive, both in articulation of the risks and also in enforcement of prudential rules from about 2005. That's one reason we didn't have as bad a great crash as other countries. But the more important thing that happened for Australia is that we were the principal international beneficiary from early in the century, and especially from 2003, by the most rapid period of sustained growth that any economy has ever had in a country that happened to be the world's most populous country, and which happened to be the most energy and metals intensive growth of any country in world history, and that gave us our China resources boom. Our terms of trade rose immensely from about 2003, taking with it average incomes, with initially a very high proportion of the increase in the terms of trade coming out as increased government revenue, both Commonwealth and states, especially the Commonwealth through the corporate income tax, capital gains tax, and other mechanisms. The China resources boom reduced the risks of our undergoing a very considerable Keynesian fiscal and monetary expansion to offset the deflationary effects of the Great Crash. So we didn't have a recession, almost unique in the OECD in 2008 and 2009. And it allowed a continuation of employment and incomes growth, not quite undiminished. We had a bit of a dip in 2008, end of 2008, 2009, but it was a very small downturn. The China resources boom also took a bit of a dip in 2008, 2009. China was hit as hard as any other country by the global financial crisis. It's an export-oriented economy, the most rapidly growing parts of the economy, very much tied into markets in Europe and North America. Suddenly the export orders stopped coming in October 2008. Stocks piled up on the wharves. China responded. 30 million people were given pink slips from manufacturing companies in the coastal towns and told to go back to their home villages. China looked as if it was facing a very severe dislocation of what had been extraordinarily strong growth. It responded with the biggest Keynesian fiscal and monetary expansion in world history. Textbook fiscal and monetary expansion in response to a collapse of demand. By the second half of 2009, growth was proceeding strongly in China. The quickest way for China to push money out into the economy to get things moving after a downturn is to push it out through the state-owned enterprises and provincial governments for infrastructure expenditure. So this further exaggerated what already had been extraordinarily metals and then energy-intensive growth, because the heavy industry of the state-owned enterprises infrastructure uses energy and metals particularly intensively. So by 2010, we had higher export prices for our iron ore and our energy, our coal, than we'd had on the eve of the Great Crash. That strong recovery in China validated the fiscal and monetary expansion in Australia that kept us going through the recession. Well, by 2010, 2011, Australian business had got used to the idea that these good times were continuing. Australian community had got used to the idea. Australian business started to invest heavily in expanding resources capacity, which they hadn't done early in the century. Well, the resources investment boom began more or less as China was deciding that it had to change its model of growth, and the strong demand growth for iron ore and coal came to an end. For a number of domestic reasons, China adopted a new model of economic growth from 2011. From 2012, that was showing up in the statistics. Much slower growth, slightly slower growth in the economy, greatly slower growth for metals imports, even slower growth, perhaps soon no growth at all in coal imports. So that pushed down Australian export prices from the September quarter of 2011. Took a long time for us to get used to the idea. Business was just gearing up for higher investment, and the resources investment boom kept on going for another few years. A huge proportion of the investment by Australian companies, especially in coal, but also in other resources, since then has had to be written off as just wasted investment. Most recently, 2 days ago, Rio Tinto wrote off virtually the whole of the $4 billion it invested in a new Mozambique coal property. But government revenues have fallen steadily from the resource sector since the September quarter of 2011. Employment relative to population and labour force has been steadily falling since the September quarter of 2011. So all of the key indicators of Australian prosperity have headed downwards since September quarter of 2011, but the expectations of our community haven't adjusted. So we're in a very difficult position now. Our cost levels, after a decade of negative productivity growth, are higher than is consistent with sustainable full employment. Some recent detailed modelling for the Melbourne Economic Forum by the Centre of Policy Studies of Victoria University, the group that Peter Dixon leads, has estimated that we would have to lift average productivity growth from the minus 0.3% of the last decade to plus 0.5%. Now that's a very big turnaround to avoid a fall in average incomes between now and the end of the century. To stand still, we would have to have a dramatic lift in productivity growth. Well, zero incomes growth, real incomes growth, effectively from 2011 till 2020 it would be a pretty unique outcome for Australia, but we have to greatly improve productivity growth for it to be only that bad. The modelling for the Melbourne Economic Forum also showed that we need a real exchange rate depreciation without compensating increase in incomes or business nominal profits of about 20% to maintain full employment during this period. Well, this is a very great challenge, and it's a challenge that we won't meet effectively without a big lift in productivity raising reform. And the biggest challenge there is that the great Australian complacency doesn't give us a good base for reform. In Dog Days, I reflect upon the differences between the reform era and the great Australian complacency that followed, and each is a product of its time. But the reform era was characterised by fairly widespread recognition in the community that things had to change, led by what I call the independent centre of the Australian polity, people without partisan political axes to grind, and people without business vested interests contributing to the public discussion of what needs to be done. Some of the important public institutions of Australia, including the Productivity Commission, contributed to that, but many elements of the private elements of the polity did as well. This period was characterised by relatively long time perspective. Some of the important reforms had their main effects a decade and more beyond the time that very hard policy decisions were made. To be a player in the discussion of policy during the reform era, the 80s and 90s, you had to couch your argument in public interest terms. A crude appeal to private interest of a kind that's characterised business and union contribution to the public discussion in the 21st century got very short shrift. It wasn't taken seriously by elements of the polity. The media, elements of the media, of course, not the whole media, but media played an important role in explaining long-term issues, serious and hard issues. And the framework of policy that focused on productivity-raising reform also had a very strong focus on equity. And this was necessary to bring the community along in support of reform. So not only were these periods of productivity-raising reform of many kinds, removal of protection, deregulation of the financial sector, and so on, but there were also times of introduction of Medicare, of a huge increase in participation in secondary and tertiary education, a huge expansion of inclusiveness in education, a widening of the social security net with family payments, and a very strong focus on the priority of low unemployment, of employment growth. Of course, the mistakes, the monetary policy mistakes that gave us deep recession in 1991 ran against that and actually damaged the community support for reform. When all of these elements of the support base for reform in the reform era are greatly weaker or absent in the early 21st century, and the causes of that are complex. Maybe we can come to that in discussion, but we can characterise the political culture that's of the Great Australian Complacency as being associated with, above all, unbridled pursuit of private interests in application of pressure on the policy process. And we've seen examples of this in union behaviour, the opposition to the nature of opposition to work choices, obviously quite legitimate to challenge it, but the way that the challenge was made. And then in the larger scale and very focused business opposition to introduction of carbon pricing, mineral resource taxation, and many other issues. So recently, a strong private interest focus on killing removal of distortions in the tax system, novation leasing deductions for income tax purposes related to motor vehicles. The unbridled use of money to apply pressure to the political process reached, for Australia, unprecedented dimensions over the last decade or so. And that has made reform in the public interest very difficult. We've had a window shone on this by the Independent Commission Against Corruption in New South Wales, which began by looking at corruption associated with some elements in the previous Labor government, but quickly revealed a much more general pattern of corrupt pressure on the political process, extending to both major political parties in New South Wales. That spotlight, I think, if it was shone with similar intensity on the Commonwealth and other states, would show not similarly egregious corrupt behaviour, but nevertheless egregious corrupt behaviour. And we've become much more tolerant of what we once would have seen very clearly as corrupt use of private power over the last decade. We're seeing this play out in the current budget discussion in Australia, where the balance of power is held by a business person of considerable complexity, but who has, in a very unvarnished way, applied money to the political process with substantial effects. He does seem to be prepared to support some measures in the public interest where they don't conflict with his private interests, and so that, I suppose, is better than comprehensive opposition to the public interest. I think the difficulties this budget is in reflect the current political culture in other ways. Major budget adjustment measures were proposed through what is for Australia an extraordinary policy advice process, a secretariat provided by the Business Council, major reforms in major changes, disruptive changes in health and education, huge complex sectors proposed simply as budget measures without the sort of public interest analysis of broad implications of what was being done that we pride ourselves as having as part of the Commonwealth policy making process in Australia. And as a consequence, the community hasn't come along with the need for budget adjustment. I've got no doubt that some very substantial budget adjustment is necessary in the period ahead in the wake of the change in our circumstances, but we're going to have to make rather fundamental changes in our political culture if it's going to be possible for us to deal with that problem or with the productivity raising reform that we need in current circumstances. Thank you.